live.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's really my pleasure tonight to be talking to Allison Epstein and Laura Samotin. Is it Lynn or Tim? Tim, Samotin. Is that right?
Samotin.
Thank you. About Fagin the Thief. And I would like to say how much I appreciate Allison writing this book, among other reasons, that as a speed reader, I am never able to read Dickens. All of the dialect just blows me out. And so this is the first sort of Dickens book that I've actually read all the way through. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Right. So let me introduce Allison, whom we've talked to before for her earlier books, A Tip for the Hangman, which was her debut, and then Let the Dead Bury the Dead. And Patrick just reminded us we still have two autographed copies of Let the Dead Bury the Dead. Laura is the author of the Adult Dark Fantasies. Tell me what that means before I go any farther, Laura. What is a dark fantasy?
That's a great question. Allison, do you know what a dark fantasy is? I would
No.
say dark fantasy is fantasy that has, I think, more intense or maybe more touchy themes. The Sins on Their Bones is a story about two ex-husbands on opposite sides of a civil war fighting over the same throne. So it has lots of themes of war and grief and abuse and all of that. So,
And it's fabulous.
but genre is always a tricky subject because
You know,
people
it
define it
so
one
is.
way.
And now that fantasy and romantasy are having this absolute boom, I'm learning all kinds of new terms in order to sort of subdivide it. Cottagecore really threw me. I mean, we had a cottagecore author. I was like, I was completely baffled. But there's epic fantasy, there's dark fantasy. Spicy is a new keyword that I have learned. That means there's plenty of sex and usually dragons, but not sex with dragons. That's an important distinction. So anyway, I find it really
To each one's
fascinating.
own.
Yeah, well, crime fiction's been divided into various categories for a really long time, and romance just kind of went along as a general field and fantasy, but now it's getting very specific. I love it. So we are in the world of Charles Dickens and Victoria. I will say that Allison has had not an astonishing number, fabulous starred reviews from all the media for her book, which I'm sure is totally well deserved. I thought it was. And in honor of the occasion, although you can't really see them, but I'll lean up, my very dear friend Anne Perry died, and her executor said that she would like me to have Anne's earrings. So I have a small selection of Anne Perry Victorian earrings, and these are the pearls. I thought it was kind of a nice touch of slightly, maybe dark.
Dark Victoriana is very much the vibe of the evening. So that's
Right, I
perfect.
know. I'm on a theme of death here for whatever. But anyway, it's sort of my little tribute to Anne, who I think would really have enjoyed this conversation had she still been with us. So, anything else you need from me? One other thing. Allison very kindly autographed a number of copies of Fagin the Thief. It is our February historical fiction. We have a subscription club, so that's the pick for this month. And we are down to maybe 6 signed copies. So if you're watching this and you think you'd like one, I recommend that you call the store immediately and grab one. Right. So I'll turn it over to you guys, Laura.
Well, thanks so much for having us. Fagin the Thief was an incredible book, and I'm so excited to talk to Allison tonight. So congrats on the publication of your latest book. I was wondering if we could start by you telling us just a little bit about the story. What's Fagin the Thief about?
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'm really glad we ended up going with the title Fagin the Thief for this book, because it really does sort of tell you what's going on in the book. It's a very self-explanatory title, but it is sort of a retelling of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist from the point of view of one of the villains, Fagin, who has never, in my opinion, really gotten enough airtime or never gotten his due. So I imagine sort of an origin story for that character and take it all the way back to when he was, a child growing up in London, and it follows his evolution into one of the most talented pickpockets that Victorian London has ever seen.
And I don't know, you said like he's a villain, and I have to be honest with you. Reading, I was like, Jacob is not a villain. Like I had such a visceral reaction when you just said that, because I just wanted to defend him, because I think one of the most incredible things you do in this book is really bring like this very, very deep sense of humanity to this extremely complicated character who, you know, when you're reading Oliver Twist and you read Dickens, he's this very, very two-dimensional, like super anti-Semitically portrayed, just like thief. He's a bad person and he's a thief. And he, like you said, he has no background. He doesn't, he just shows up and he does thief stuff and then he leaves. And so like I finished reading this and I was like, I feel so deeply for him because Jacob is not a good person, but I would argue that he's also not a villain. So I kind of like would love to hear, like, what were you drawn to in the character of Fagin? And like, what was your first memory of, you know, him as a character? And then how did that memory turn into writing a whole book?
Yeah, my first memory of Fagin was me sitting in the back seat of my grandmother's car when she's playing the Oliver the Musical cassette tape from like the 1996 cast.
Not what I
So
thought you were going to say.
it was such a visceral memory to me. Is just the song "You Gotta Pick a Pocket or Two" was the best song in that musical, and so when I was a small theater kid, I emotionally imprinted on the character of Fagin and thought, that's that weirdo. I love him. He's fantastic. So like I've always had him in the back of my mind as sort of an interesting, larger than life character. But like at 7 or 8 years old, I couldn't read Oliver Twist. That was too much for me. So I had to wait like, a number of years until I could read the original, and that experience, the dissonance between what I imagined Fagin was and how I had felt this affection for him and what Dickens obviously thought of him was just that was a really strange experience. But at the same time, I don't know if it's because I had this, preconceived love for him already, or because there's something in the book even so, but I still kind of loved Fagin in Oliver Twist, even though he is the most problematic thing I've ever read. I still kind of have he's my problematic fave. He's fascinating, he's interesting, he's messy, he's funny, he's smart, and I just wanted Dickens to have done more with him than he did. So I kept waiting for someone else to write the book about Fagin, and eventually I had to do it. So
Maybe that's the definition of dark fantasy is the book with your new problematic fave. Because like
yes.
who doesn't want like, I don't know, a scrappy adoptive crime dad? Like,
Thank you.
no,
Yes.
like hello, like
We all want this,
what
right?
more could
We're all so
you
normal.
want? Right. This makes total sense to me. So I mean, you already kind of talked about how like when you go from like hearing like the musical to reading the book, obviously there's a huge dissonance there in like kind of I would say like the goofy kind of sinister that Fagin is, versus in the book where he's like I wouldn't call him sinister because he's not really even very much there. Like he has no depth to be sinister. It's just like, oh, a Jew, watch out.
Yeah.
Shocking. So like what was the most challenging part for you as a writer of adopting a character for like this new book that so many people already had preconceived notions about and were familiar with? Like, how did you think about challenging the reader to leave behind Dickens's one-dimensional characterization of Fagin and kind of like step into your book and be ready to receive kind of like this new characterization of someone that we all already know?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I thought about this a lot because nobody's more passionate than a Dickens fan. And so the last thing I wanted to do is attract a bunch of Dickens fans and then make them angry with the portrayal that didn't feel accurate. So I really tried as much as I could to stay within the bounds of what Dickens gives us in Oliver Twist as far as the plot and the actions. There's some I had to change for the sake of my story, but like the by and large, it follows what you would be familiar with. The first chapter of Fagin the Thief is the same scene where we meet Fagin and Oliver Twist, just told from the other side. So I did want to keep it grounded in that way because I thought if I can show sort of the world that Dickens gave us, but step inside the character and feel it, that might be something that readers are open to. It gives them something familiar, but it also gives you something different. And I think it was easier to do that in a way because of the way that Dickens wrote Oliver Twist. It's a very plot heavy book. It's not a deep character study. He doesn't really, for any of the characters in Oliver Twist, spend too much time going into motivations. Why is this person doing what they're doing? I've been describing it lately as sort of like a fairy tale where the good characters succeed and the evil characters are punished in the end. And that's sort of the kind of story he's telling. So I wanted to take the shape that he gave me, but do something different with it.
Yeah, and like I think you did a beautiful job of that. Like as I was reading this book, I was just like, I feel cold and I smell lots of bad smells. And like also like I'm really hungry because like one of the things that I loved in particular about what you did for the book was bringing that same Dickensian like level of detail and attention to the setting and the atmosphere. I was like, this is, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but I was like, this is what Dickens should have done. Not to knock Dickens, but it's not like he can, it's not like he can come back. He's
He's
dead.
doing all right. Yeah, I do just want to say briefly, I love that you said it made you hungry because every reader I've talked to so far has said this sounds like the worst food I've ever heard of in my life. What they're eating in this book, it's just horrifying. So that
Okay.
makes me happy.
Maybe I should have said unhungry, but so I know that you had called the book something else because I remember seeing the announcement on Publishers Marketplace, and I think it was just called Fagin, right?
It's gone through a few iterations. The draft that's still like draft one on my computer is still called Fagin. That's what I started writing it as.
So like I thought it was so interesting that the title that you ended up with was Fagin the Thief, because to me, like one of the big threads that's like pulled through this book, and that was I thought really interesting to examine from Fagin's perspective, is this idea of like fate on the one hand, but also like societal determinism on the other, because early on in his childhood, you have this scene where his mom is like, you have to go watch this hanging, and like this is what you're going to turn into. She's basically like, you're destined to be a thief, like your dad was a criminal, and this is just like, this is what's going to happen to you in life. And like lo and behold, like he did become one. So like in your mind, like did he ever have another path that he could have walked? Or like does being poor and being a Jew means that like if he wants to eat today, he has work to do, like you say in the book? Like was he always going to be Fagin the thief, or was there a world where maybe society was less prejudiced or less classist where he could have been Fagin the something else?
Yeah, I was thinking about fate a lot through this book, and when his mother takes Jacob to watch the hanging, I think that was the question she was asking herself: is this the only route ahead for my son? But what I was imagining her doing in that moment is showing this is what's ahead for you if you don't shape up and start doing something else. This is your fork in the road, and if you decide to continue on the path you're going, this is where you will end up. Please don't do that. But I think you're absolutely right. The question that you're wrestling with in this book is, what else was he going to do? What other path is available for somebody who has no connections, no money, no place in society? There's no soft place for him to land anywhere. What I've kind of come to think at this point is that there is a world in which a poor Jewish person in Victorian London can become something else. I don't think there was ever a world that Jacob Fagin could have been anything else. I think the combination of his circumstances and the way that he thinks and acts, I think I don't know that he could ever have gotten off this path without being a different person.
Yeah, and like I know like the book mentions, there are some Jews in Victorian London who become successful, who are from wealthy families, and who do we even had, Jewish politicians who were in
Yeah.
Parliament in that time. Like it's not inconceivable, but to me, what was so gut-wrenching about the book was how he could see that. like he was literally walking through these like wealthy parts of town, and he had access to that, but he was so trapped, either by society or the confluence of all of these factors. It's not just that you're a Jew, you are also poor, you are also poorly educated. But like he could literally see the other option, and yet there was this invisible barrier he could never break through. So to me, that was just one of the most heartbreaking parts of it, and gave me so much sympathy for him. And is, I think, one of the things that you just did masterfully as an author was convince me that someone who literally is the thief is a criminal. He is not a good person. He makes terrible choices.
Yes, he does.
Like, there are many times I wanted to reach into the book and shake him and be like, Jacob, just
stop.
Stop. Like, you're doing it to yourself. Make a better choice. But it's also really hard as a reader to see, like, well, what better choice could he have made? Like, at the same time as I was trying to acknowledge, like baby girl, you're making bad choices here. I was also like, okay, but like being realistic, what else could he do? Like, how, like even the very privileged Jews in society were still kind of on the outside. Like,
yeah, and that was, as I was really researching like this period, that was so interesting to me, that like this very particular Victorian English brand of anti-Semitism, which I hadn't really thought about specifically a lot. I mean, I was familiar with it because I was an English major in college, and every book you read from that period is doing something weird about the Jews at some point. So I knew the water I was walking into. But what I wasn't aware of was how much of it was kind of quiet behind the scenes. Like, it wasn't legally imposed on British society the same way that it was in other countries in Europe at this time, but there was just this quiet, simmering, you can come in and you can even be a member of parliament if you'd like to be, but for no second will we ever let you believe that you actually belong here.
You're like the Jew in parliament.
Exactly.
You're not like a member.
And we're going to have to debate for months about how you can take your oath of office, because we can't fathom how you could not hold a Christian Bible and also uphold your oath of office. Like, that just
exactly
blew people's minds. Yeah.
So, I think for me as a Jewish reader and as a Jewish author, one of the things that I found really special about the book is Jacob like talking about and wrestling with his Judaism, and he grows up in a Jewish enclave. And I learned a lot in the book about kind of this Jewish community in 1800s London. So I wanted to know kind of what was your research process there, and like how did you learn about the community? What was the research that you were doing like, and what's like some of the most historical, interesting facts that you learned about the Jewish community in Great Britain in the 1800s?
Yeah, I started kind of way back in my research, because there's, like I was saying, England's relationship with Judaism is very strange. There's hundreds of years in sort of early modern medieval England where Jews are not allowed to exist in the country of England. They were expelled from the country entirely. And so Jewish history in England sort of starts, and then it stops, and then it starts up again later when that law is repealed. Not to say that there were never, Jewish people secretly practicing their religion in England. Of course there were, but it was believed that there were none. So once this community sort of was able to come back and start building itself up again, it made perfect sense to me that it would sort of be an insular community. You want to stay with people who you trust and who believe how you believe and kind of live in a similar culture that you do. And it was just interesting for me to research that kind of community, especially because of the way that Dickens portrays Fagin as so alone. He is a Jew, but he is also a singular Jew. He is by himself, isolated from any sort of community or any sort of culture. And that just frustrated me as I kept reading it, as I would reread this book. And I just wanted to put that character in context in some way.
Yeah, it's like he just kind of appears out of nowhere in Oliver Twist and then just vanishes into nowhere. Like, I don't actually even know if Dickens ever says where he lives.
That's the one thing he does say. Dickens is very particular about where that house is, and that's the only detail that we get.
But he just popped up. He didn't have a family. He doesn't have a
No.
community. Okay, I guess we know his address, but we don't nothing else about him. He just came fully formed to be like, your adoptive crime dad. Yeah, so what were some interesting facts about being Jewish in 1800s London that you learned?
Yeah, I was particularly interested in there was a there were a number of synagogues in London. I don't know why that surprised me. That should not have surprised me. But there were like large temples that would welcome, hundreds and hundreds of Jews every Friday night. And that just I don't know why I had never thought about that before, but just looking at pictures of them was it like made me think about that time period differently because I think we all have sort of a standard image of what Victorian London looks like, and it's either the Dickensian orphans or it's the balls of Bridgerton, and there's sort of nothing else going on in that world. And it made me think, there's a whole world going on here that just doesn't make it into standard narratives of history.
Yeah, and like a whole like a vibrant Jewish community. I like to, you know, I like to think that there were at least some people who were able to like live as, open Jews and be relatively successful. Because I do think that one thing that we see frequently in literature is just like the oppressed Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I did appreciate this like nuanced portrayal of Fagin, who like, you know, maybe he's a thief, but ultimately he's like pretty successful at what he does. So,
Yeah,
and he's
he's pretty self-actualized as far as it goes.
fun doing it. I'm sorry, but like he's definitely having fun doing the thieving.
Oh yeah, this is his dream job, absolutely, and he's very good.
So one of the things, like speaking of Fagin, being a whole person who has more than just an address, I really thought that the relationship that you crafted between Bill, Jacob, and Nancy was so beautifully nuanced and so gut-wrenching. I wanted to like hear you talk about the way that you envisioned Jacob as a character with a romantic life and with romantic inclinations. And I also like would love to hear about how you envisioned, his relationship with Bill and Nan and Bill's relationship with each other, and kind of what that says about the way that people can, care very much for each other and yet still hurt each other very deeply.
Yes, yeah, that's the sentence that underlines the three of them in this book. They all three of them care so deeply for each other, and they are all so very bad for each other in so many ways. But yeah, as far as thinking about Fagin in a romantic context, I had this conversation with my editor actually as I was drafting, and she asked me, you know, as you're building out this full life, do you think would it be interesting to give him a love interest in this book? And I said, no, that's not the kind of story that I'm telling here. Partly because the way that I understand Jacob Fagin is just deeply afraid of needing anybody, of being reliant on others, and of opening himself up and being vulnerable to others. I couldn't picture him in a romantic relationship in which he felt safe enough to say, this is what I feel and this is what I want. That's You ask him to do that and he's going to turn around and run the other way for 6 miles. So
He's like a cat. Like if you reach out and touch
yes.
him, he's gonna run away.
Mhm.
But maybe he will come to you a little bit and like touch you, like
Maybe, but on his terms
on his
only. Yeah. And so it was really interesting to me once I had figured out that about kind of his interaction with the world to think about, okay, the one relationship he really has in the original is with Bill Sykes. They've been working together for, a decade, 20 years. And they, in the original, hate each other. They're never a nice thing to say to anybody. There's an aside in one of the chapters where Fagin is offering to Nancy, if you want me to kill him, I'll kill him. I'm like, oh, okay. But they're still working together and they don't need to. There's obviously something that's keeping them together because it would be so much easier to just work by yourself. Why are you with this person? And so as I was writing, I really wanted to interrogate what's bringing these two people together. What are they getting out of this that they can't get by being alone? And you you want to talk about two people who are incapable of talking about their emotions but want to be loved so badly. That was my Jacob and Bill. they both want the same thing and they absolutely cannot get it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think again that you did kind of a beautiful job of making Jacob a three-dimensional character who I really just fell in love with, and like again, at times wanted to shake and at times wanted to give a very big hug to, because he needs it. Congratulations again on another beautiful book. I was wondering, so are there other characters in literature or history that you'd like to tackle in the future, or can you give us a hint about what you're working on next?
Yeah. There are definitely other characters I've been toying around with. I've been threatening my agent for years to write a Dracula retelling focusing on the cowboy from Dracula. I don't know if I'm ever going to actually do it, but someday I'm going to pull the trigger and actually do that.
I vote for that one.
Fabulous. The one I'm really considering is there's a Renaissance Italian saint who um, had ecstatic visions of her own marriage to Jesus. And I've been obsessed with her since college. It's St. Catherine of Siena. And every time I think about her, I'm like, where's my St. Catherine of Siena novel? So I'm not committing to that. I haven't told my editor that yet, but those are the two I'm playing with to
Well,
see.
if Allison's editor, if you're watching, you have at least one reader.
Perfect.
Uh,
I got two. All right.
Right, yeah, that'd be sort of fun. While you were talking, I remembered that I edited a book that was when Poison Pen Press was still ours before we sold it to Random House, about the expulsion of the Jews from England, which Edward the First did. I looked it up to make sure I get the date right. So basically, well, I had the date right. Where'd it go? Anyway, they were left, I think it was 1290, something around that time, and then they returned somewhat informally in like the 1660s. I think some of them came from France, if I remember right. So, it wasn't the Inquisition in England. I've never been entirely sure why Edward decided, he was married to a very Catholic queen. He was off on crusade and other stuff. So that might have had a lot to do with it. But in Victorian times, there were, as we're looking around at oligarchs at the moment, there were some of the oligarchs were in fact, wealthy Jews. And Edward himself, not his mother, but Edward was friends, spent time with quite a few of them. You got families like the Rothschilds and, so Jacob was at the wrong end of the financial spectrum to really do well, I think, in Victorian London. But do you think it was so much because he was Jewish or just because he was so poor? I mean, I've walked around in those areas today. They've been sort of gentrified, but it must have been an absolute rat hole back when you're talking about it. And they didn't even know, enough for the drinking water. You have a scene in your book that talks about it took like 15 minutes to go and get water from the communal water supply. And, I'm going, oh, disease everywhere. No, but they didn't
Yes.
really have anywhere else to go.
Yeah. I mean, it was certainly the standard of living if you're not in the 1% in Victorian London was awful. And I mean, Dickens paints that so well in all of his books, like the absolute squalor that these people are living in. There's cholera constantly, just the death toll is incredible. So there's certainly it's multifaceted. I think there's the class aspect of it, but I do also think that there is an identity aspect to it too. I think he's Jacob is a double outsider in that way. He's on the outside of what society allows you to be as a respectable Christian person who can kind of go into these spaces and be a laborer or somebody who's sort of seen to be part of the majority. He's on the outs both culturally and economically, and I think that makes it extra difficult to kind of make
Sure, it does. As a person, I'm married. My husband is a Rosenwald, so I'm married to a prominent Jewish into a prominent. I didn't marry the whole family, just married about. Married into a prominent Jewish family, but um, I have we have kind of an interesting dynamic when we travel. he's into stained glass. So I, the Episcopalian, tour synagogues, and Rob goes to cathedrals, lies on the floor, and shoots the stained glass. But it all works out. But I've been in synagogues all over Europe and places like South Africa and the whole bit. And I'm trying to remember if I have ever thought about going to a synagogue in London. So was there, in fact, an actual religious nexus, so to speak, for people like Fagin?
There was, yeah, there was the Alderney Road Synagogue in the Victorian era was the largest one in London, and I wish I could recall if it's still there today, but I know it was at least for 100 years. It was the centerpiece of that community, and there was a Jewish specific cemetery attached, which would be sort of anybody in any community that would be where you would bury your dead.
Well, sometimes I wonder if the very strong community that we see here in Scottsdale, for example, there's a JCC right up the road. If in some ways, all that pulls Jews together, I also wonder sometimes if it's slightly exclusive. How much
I
of
think
it is
that
generated,
I
you
think that
know,
anytime you have a community that's ostracized by the mainstream, it's definitely a defense mechanism to, come together because, as Jacob is kind of explaining, his view is nothing I can do will ever remove the stain of being a Jew. Like it is who I am. And so nothing I could do. I could be in parliament. I could be Benjamin Disraeli. Like I could be like the highest of the high, and I will still, like Allison was saying, be the Jew. And so I think that one of the things that I found, again, Allison, like really special in your portrayal of him was kind of how despite all of that and despite the anti-Semitism and despite the kind of even like outsized punishments a Jewish thief would get compared to a Christian thief, he was able still to find community and build community, even as like the black cat. Like I barely want to acknowledge that I need human connection, but he was still able to find that and still have a bit of that defiance in recognizing like this is my culture and these are my people, and even if it's difficult, I will protect kind of that part of myself. So I think that it's very much who doesn't want to be accepted, right? Who doesn't want to have to like who wouldn't choose to be the mainstream if you could, right? Like no one would choose to have a difficult life. And I don't think Jacob does. And so, to me, watching him kind of struggle with that, and also, not that it was a central theme of the book, but his relationship with his religion, the thing that makes him on the outside and kind of has set him on this path, like it wasn't purely a self-hating thing. Like it wasn't purely like this is so awful. Like he does find some comfort in it and he does have moments of appreciating it. So that to me was, a really interesting dynamic and really made me think, kind of about him in this different light. Like I love that you reclaimed his Judaism as a part of him and not his defining characteristic.
Yeah, it's a part of how he thinks about the world, but it's not the central part, but it is an important part. And that's how I wanted it to be portrayed in this book, because so often when Fagin is adapted, it's either the only thing there is about him, he's Jewish and that's it, or it's not there at all. He's this interesting thief in Victorian London, but we're not going to talk about the Judaism because that would lead into anti-Semitic stereotype, and people are weary of bringing those two things together. And I wanted him to be able to have both, to be able to be this character I was in love with, but also that part of his background, his culture is important to him and to
I was actually, so I was going to ask you, speaking of, historical fiction and speaking of books, I know I, for one, had a horrible book hangover after reading this book. And because I had the privilege of reading it early, it was also awful because I couldn't talk to anyone about it. And all I wanted was to find the other members of the Jacob fan club and like kibitz with them about the book. So finally I can, thank God. But for all of us who read Fagin the Thief and, now are looking for, what's next. Like, do you have anything that you'd recommend? If we love Fagin the Thief, do you have favorite books that inspired you or authors that you think that we would vibe with? Like, what's your reading list for us once we've read the last page of Fagin the Thief?
That's such a good question. I have two that come to mind immediately, and I'm sure if you ask me this again in 5 minutes, I'll have two different ones. But the one that was most influential to me, like from a vibes standpoint, was Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, which I recommend to everybody always. That is, if you want a Victorian thief adventure, pick that up and then call me when you're done, and I want to talk to you about it because it's so good. But another book that I really loved lately and have just been flinging in people's faces is When the Angels Left the Old Country by Sasha Lamb, which is
Yeah.
such a beautiful kind of coming to America story starring a Jewish angel and a Jewish demon, sort of like it's an odd couple romance friendship. And it's a very different kind of book to Fagin the Thief, but I think it has that same sense of being suffused with a culture in a sort of defiant way that I was aiming for. I thought it was really inspiring to me in that way.
Yeah, I'll throw out my own. So The City Beautiful by Aiden Polidoros, like gave me like it's young adult, but it gave me like again like those defiant vibes and like a beautifully rendered kind of vision of a particular time and place and about Jewish characters where it wasn't their entire identity, but also like it wasn't erased entirely. So well, again, congratulations on your book launch. Thank you so much. And thank you, Barbara, for, hosting this conversation. I think that we might have some audience questions.
We do. Patrick will come up and say that. Let me say at the moment, on March 17th, Sibby Owen is going to be talking to her friend Zach about her book on being Jewish today. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's I think a series of essays and so forth that Zibby, also owner of Zibby Books, has put together. I think it's a really wonderful book. She was here earlier, and now she's coming back after the Tucson Festival of Books. So if you're interested in, modern thoughts as opposed to historical, and there are also some really good books set in other countries besides England, on, Jewish history in various places. I would also like to ask Allison, without doing any spoilers here, but did you know how this book was going to end from the beginning? Because I really commend you for the way you finished it. That's going to drive everyone crazy, right? Because
I will tell you, I didn't. I knew how I didn't want it to end, but I was writing the entire book, waiting for the right way to end it to come, and I figured it out one morning commuting to work. Just the answer to where it was supposed to go hit me, and I just like threw my phone down in my lap and said, "That's it. That's what it's supposed to be." And that was just really satisfying. So I'm glad it landed.
It's really perfect. I was so pleased because, there's always a sort of sense of dread that hangs over you when you're reading a book where you think that no, the character's never going to get a break. It's heartwarming to find something that is not the easy route. So I think you did a wonderful job. And I suspect some of these outstanding reviews are written partly from a sense of relief.
It's very possible.
Right. So Patrick, where are you? There he is.
Here. It's funny. For my discussion group tonight at the store, we're reading this book by Fuminori Nakamura called The Thief.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a noir, but it's about a pickpocket. And so thought that was fun. One of the questions that came in was, Allison, do you know how to pickpocket? Have you studied the dark arts?
Oh my God, have you done practical training? Because that would be so awesome. I mean, like not if you actually from people, but like knowing the skill would be awesome.
I have never picked somebody's pocket in real life. You can still meet me in the world and your wallets will be safe. But I did a lot of very specific research for how somebody would go about doing it. So there are weirdly a lot of primary sources from the Victorian era about how thieves mechanically would pickpockets, like in the street, in a store, on a bus. They would write a different kind of technical explanation for each of them. And so I will say I've read more about picking pockets than someone who's never picked a pocket probably should have.
You have to have very deft fingers. That brings me I happen to have this because I was making a hotel reservation. Do you guys know what this is? I bought it up at Taliesin West, the Frank Lloyd Wright thing, and it never had occurred to me that it was necessary. This is one of those little cases in which you are now supposed to carry all your credit cards and so forth, because pickpockets today with a scanner can go by you, and they don't have to take your wallet or take cards out of your wallet. All they have to do is scan and hack your. So these things, I can't remember the exact term, but this is apparently impervious to being.
Wallet. And then actually, I'm gonna butt in because Allison, that's an amazing question. If Jacob was like in our world today, what kind of con or scam would he carry out?
Oh,
Like
that's such a good
he was
question.
if he was here right now in 2025, what would his like grift be? Because he would have one.
Oh, he absolutely would. Yeah. I don't know if this is true, but it feels true. I imagine him being the very best at a multi-level marketing scheme. I
Oh,
think if he's talking his way into getting 500 different people to buy a bunch of knives from him and sell knives door to door, and he doesn't do
Cutco.
any of the work. Yeah, it's exactly.
He would be doing Cutco because he would be good at recruiting the people and then finding the people to recruit who would be good at recruiting other people, right?
Yes, and he could sell door to door if he had to, but at this point, why would you? You can get everybody else to do it
Brilliant.
for
Let's see here. Did did you guys already talk about, do you have any other favorite Dickens novels? Are you a real Dickens enthusiast, or was it this particular story that intrigued you?
I came to Dickens through this story first. I wasn't necessarily a Dickens devotee originally. I'm a fan now. I had to come into it and sit in it in a while. My favorite Dickens is probably A Tale of Two Cities. I just think that's brilliant. I'm also a big fan of Bleak House just because it's so deeply weird. It's got every kind
But
of book in it. It's a marriage story and a detective story, and a man catches on
Le-
fire spontaneously for no reason. It's wonderful.
it's so good.
Legal thriller.
Yes, it's got everything. I think there should be the next Knives Out film should be an adaptation of Bleak House. I think that would be
My parents actually bought me a copy of they're watching, so hi mom and dad. They bought me a copy for one Valentine's Day, and
That's romantic.
great.
it is. I love A Tale of Two Cities, and I haven't read this book, so I'm just shouting it out because I'm so excited about it. But A Far Better Thing by H.G. Perry is a retelling of Sydney Carton with like fairies.
It's
I'm
on
like,
my to read list 100%.
I'm ravenous. If you get an early copy, I just
I'll pass it along.
I'll come
She's a
pickpocket you.
marvelous writer, isn't she? I think she lives in New Zealand. If I remember right, she lives in Wellington, New Zealand. I
You
think
may,
so.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I remember reading her first book from Orbit and how much I loved it. She's a very, very talented writer. I looked it up. These things are actually called RFID blocking, which I mean, who knew? I just, I mean, the tradition of pickpocketing is centuries old. It's just evolving into the digital age.
Absolutely. There's always a new way to do it.
It was a new grift.
There's a question here. Curious about Laura. Can you please give us the elevator pitch about your book
Yeah.
or books?
The Sins on Their Bones is an adult dark fantasy. It's the story of two ex-husbands on opposite sides of a civil war fighting over the same throne, and there is a very daring and very handsome spy master caught in the crossfire. It came out from Penguin Random House in May, and the sequel, The Lure of Their Graves, is actually coming out in June of this year. So the duology will be complete.
That was a very well polished pitch.
It was.
Thank you. My marketing team a lot on it. And when you become an author, I think the most intimidating thing at first is when someone says, "Tell me what your book is about." But then Allison, like you have a lot more experience than me. Like eventually, like it just rolls off the tongue.
Eventually it does, but the first time is always it's about a guy and he does things and he's in a place and then they've already walked away. So
Like I don't know. My favorite is I don't know.
yeah.
That's where I'm at with my most recent project. I was talking to my agent. She said, what's it about?" And I was like, "I'm not sure. It's a book."
Allison, what was the Dracula thing you mentioned in passing? I was like, oh, that's interesting.
I want to write someday a Dracula retelling that focuses on the character of Quincy Morris, who is the Texan who shows up in the middle of Dracula and just shoots everything with his gun, and he wears a Texan hat around, and it doesn't make any sense at all for him to be in the book Dracula. Everybody else is a very polished British gentleman, and then he just shows up and he kind of saves the day in the end. So I have always sort of loved him for his fish out of water energy and kind of wondered what his deal is.
So have
Is
you like
he? I was just gonna ask. Yeah, I'm trying to. I don't remember that character. Was he like associated with Van Helsing and all those guys, or
He
the
was
Harkers?
one of the three men who was in love with Lucy. There was the
Okay,
doctor, there was her husband, then there was this random Texan who showed up.
the Texan.
You could
Yeah,
call it the Random Texan. That's actually
that's
a pretty
great.
good title.
That's kind of a Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sort of idea, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. Let's see. Uh, Someone asked, did you listen to the musical music while you wrote this book?
There are two songs from the musical on the playlist that I listened to while I wrote this book. I listened to the Jonathan Pryce's Fagin a lot for some reason. That was the one that was available on Spotify, and I don't know why, but it did the job.
Okay, someone tunes in that Fagin would absolutely be an Avon rep today. Just amusing.
This is canon. I support it.
He
Absolutely.
would be really good at flattering people. He'd be like, he would somehow convince you to buy like 7 different lipsticks all in different colors because that is your color.
All of
Like
them are. Yeah.
all of
Right.
them are. Absolutely.
He'd be, well, nothing. I was going to say something political, but I won't. Um, yeah, I think that's about it. Well, what about TV or film stuff? Any bites?
Not yet, but if you know somebody who's interested, my inbox is always open.
Great. That's
That's
it as far as
that's actually
questions.
the very last question I should have asked, Allison, is where can people find you? So if they want to keep in touch with you and hear what's going on in your literary world, like what's the best place to keep in touch?
That's a great question. As the places that you can find me on the internet gradually get smaller and smaller as days go by. The easiest place is my website, AllisonEpstein.com. I am also on Instagram at Rapscallison. It's Rapscallion with an S. And I also do a Substack, which is my newsletter called Dirtbags Through the Ages. Every other week, it is a small essay about a terrible, terrible person from history and why I love them so much.
And it's very entertaining. I know.
Really marvelous one. I know we should send me the link, will you? And I'll
Absolutely
get
will.
it into our newsletter because I think we have plenty of customers who would truly enjoy yeah, I would myself. It'd be great. Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Allison. It's lovely to see you again. And what a pleasure to meet you, Laura. And I will have to look up your book and June, it's not far away.
Yeah,
Can
thank
be
you so much for
practicing the
having
new
us.
pitch.
Yeah, thanks
Now
so
we're
much for
having
having
fun.
us, Barbara. This was wonderful.
Oh, listen, it's really a pleasure. One day we're going to actually get you here.
I would love that, especially if you can do it in the winter when it's 10 degrees in
Yes.
Chicago. I will be there.
Well,
A
there's quite
handful
a,
of
I'm a
Epstein product.
A
Northwestern
whole
grad
collection.
myself, and there's quite a large Northwestern alumni group here. Loads of Chicagoans fleeing the winter. So,
I understand why.
maybe we can work that out at some point. It would be great. Anyway, it was lovely to spend time with you all. So thank you so much. Thank you, virtual audience, for joining us.
Yes,
Have
thanks
a
everybody
wonderful
for being
evening.
here.
Yep. Bye.